So, welcome to this UCL Lunch Hour lecture on Jeremy Bentham, the London University, and Other Stories. My name is Sam Zeitlin, and I study and teach in the History Department here at UCL. Before we begin today's lecture, we'd like to briefly recognize that 2026 marks UCL's bicentenary. It's an important moment for us as a community, and to open the event, we'll share a short film that reflects on this milestone for the institution, for the university. After that, we'll move straight into the lecture.
200 years ago, there was no university in London, and we're really marking the coming of a very radical, very different institution to a city that was the largest city in the world.
UCL was to be open to people of all faiths, or indeed no faith.
Women were admitted to the Slade School of Fine Art when it opened at the start of the 1870s, and from 1878 women were able to come to UCL, study alongside men and get a degree. And this was way before any other university was giving degrees to women.
In UCL's bicentennial year, you can expect a major new exhibition, 3 books, installations from renowned artists, and UCL Illuminated, a spectacular immersive sound and light show on our central London campus.
The main chord is going to turn into a multi-day theatre with filming, workshop, lights, laughter, comedy, theatre and drama. It's going to be magic.
I'm really excited about telling people the story of how we as an institution have evolved over 200 years and how we're going to evolve for the next 200 years.
So it's now my honor and pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Philip Schofield, one of the most distinguished scholars across the humanities, social sciences, history, and law at UCL. Professor Philip Schofield is professor of the history of legal and political thought in the Faculty of Laws and director of the Bentham Project at University College London. Professor Schofield is the general editor of the new authoritative edition of the collected works of Jeremy Bentham, for which he has edited or co-edited at least 13 volumes and has published a range of books and articles on Bentham's life and work. Before we begin, I wanted to let you know that we will have some time at the end of the lecture for questions, and these can be submitted at any point during the talk by going to Slido, that's sli.do, which you can enter into your internet browser, and we'll have also a QR code that you can scan, and then entering the event code, which is hashtag Jeremy Bentham, all one word. I'll now hand over to Professor Schofield for his lecture today. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sam, for that introduction. There are perhaps several reasons for thinking that Jeremy Bentham, who, just to remind you, was born in 1748 and died in 1832, there are several reasons for thinking that Bentham, the utilitarian, philosopher and reformer, was the founder of the University of London, the institution which became University College, London in 1836 and University College without a comma, London in 1981. So the first reason is being in possession of the corpse, which does suggest some connection with the deceased. The second reason is that Bentham bought one of the 1,000 or more shares, £100 each, that were issued to fund the building of the university, and so he was a proprietor. And third, H.L. Bellott, who wrote the official centenary history of UCL, published in 1929, was in no doubt. He noted that Bentham's, and I quote, plan for a Crestomathic school was a forecast of the University of London. It was to be launched by a body of shareholders in a joint stock company. This was the Crestomathic School, and he's drawing parallels with UCL. It was to be cheap and in the end self-supporting. By virtue of being non-residential, it was to be free from the embarrassing need to provide religious teaching. It was to attend to useful and not merely to ornamental instruction, and it was therefore to educate its pupils in a great variety of subjects, not at that date commonly recognised as part even of a university curriculum. Having explained that Bentham had little active involvement in the foundation, Hale Bellott continues, the intellectual debt of the university to Bentham and the close association with him as some of the most prominent among the promoters is beyond dispute. And he goes on to name James Mill, both a prominent disciple of Bentham and a prominent member of the University Council, as the immediate source of Benthamite influence. Even more effusive was the philosopher Charles K. Ogden, who gave a lecture on the centenary of Bentham's death in 1932. He began his account of Bentham's interest in education with the following enigmatic statement. One day it will be realised that this great institution, London University, arose directly out of a series of footnotes, out of the sad case of Mr. Beardmore, and out of Jug. Now, these three terms refer respectively to Bentham's major work on education, called Chrestomathea, which means useful learning, to a gentleman who was said to have died from ennui once he retired from business, and to Bentham's view of religion as a juggernaut which crushed all those who came under its influence. I'll return to Chrestomathea and to Mr. Beardmore later. So, a fourth reason, and this concerns the slide you see now, is Henry Tonk's painting entitled The Founders of University College, dating from 1922, and it portrays Bentham studying the plans for the new university building with the architect William Wilkins in supplication, the politician Henry Brougham, the poet Thomas Campbell, and the diarist Henry Cobbe Robinson anxiously awaiting the verdict. Despite the prominent location of the painting in the Flaxman Gallery, the scene is mythical. Bentham was closely associated with Brougham, but he did not meet Cobbe Robinson until 1831, several years after this painting is set, and for all we know, never met Campbell or Wilkins. Indeed, until very recently, we had no evidence that Bentham ever visited the university. But we do now have some evidence. At the Bentham Project, we've recently transcribed manuscripts for an essay entitled Blackstone Familiarised, in which Bentham criticised the famous Commentaries on the Laws of England, published by William Blackstone of the University of Oxford between 1765 and 1769. Bentham began the essay with what he termed a dream. One version of the relevant text begins as follows. Once upon a time, no matter when, it cannot have been long ago, I, no matter who I am, dreamed a dream. Now Bentham set the scene in the lecture room of the London University, and he goes on. The forms were filled with scholars. At the upper end, on an elevated station before a long bench, were placed 4 desks or boxes similar to those which, in the Westminster Hall courts, are placed before the judges. At a lower elevation, under one of the 4 boxes, was a seat with another such box before it. And he goes on to describe the scene as the goddess of justice enters with her 3 daughters, representing law as it is, law as it ought to be, and law as it pretends to be, with the lower seat, the 5th seat, reserved for William Blackstone. It's actually very funny. But the point here is that the fact that Bentham situates his dream in a University of London lecture room is a rare piece of evidence, albeit circumstantial, as he would have termed it, that he may have visited the new university. Now, the passage was written on the 30th of September 1828, the year in which teaching commenced here. And given Bentham's recorded forays away from his so-called hermitage at Queen Square Place, his home in Westminster, and his capacity for physical exercise in the form of half walking, half running, we think he was probably the first jogger. It's not implausible to think that he might have made his way to Gower Street. Moreover, 30th of September 1828 was the very day on which a general meeting of the proprietors was held in one of the new university lecture rooms. Bentham, as I said, was a proprietor, and so he may have attended the meeting, though it's a shame that his name does not appear in the list of persons present recorded in the official minute book. Okay, let's move on to a 5th reason. And this comes from rather more dubious source, namely Ripley's Believe It or Not. I was sent an invitation to the grand opening of Ripley's Museum in Piccadilly Circus on the 3rd of September 2008, which explained that it would be the strangest grand opening ever held in London. They've since moved to Blackpool, though I doubt that the same claim about strangeness could be made there. Anyway, the invitation contained an image of what purported to be Jeremy Bentham's head and had the following explanation. So I quote Ripley's: "Though dead for the last 176 years since 1832, the dressed up bag of bones and dust of what was English philosopher Jeremy Bentham still presides in morbid silence over the Board of Trustees meetings at London's University College Hospital, which he founded. As his sightless eyes forever stare outright as various important bits of business come before the board, old Jeremy is consulted, and when no answer comes from behind his grinning teeth, he is recorded as present but not voting. Why? Because he left his entire fortune to the hospital and willed it so, and so he sits." Now, the invitation came in a box which contained the item you can now see on your screen. And we heard in yesterday's lunchtime lecture, for those of you who are privileged enough to be there, about the investigations that scientists here at UCL have been undertaking in relation to Bentham's preserved remains and extracting DNA, and in particular his head. And so there on the left is a picture of Bentham's real head, and on the right, the Ripley's head. I wonder which version you would prefer to display on your sideboard. Anyway, Ripley's magazine had earlier carried a story about Bentham's ghost terrorising UCL, apparently because the head had been separated from the rest of the body. Here's Ripley's comic. And on the invitation that accompanies Ripley's head, as I have just noted, it was stated that Bentham had founded UCH, and that Bentham still presides at meetings of the trustees of UCH. Quite how the hospital rather than the university was picked up by the authorities at Ripley's has not yet been deemed worthy of investigation by Bentham scholars. But the more usual version of the story is that Bentham attends meetings of the College Council. Now, surely this is a myth. Oh well, maybe not. Anyway, there are other tales told about Bentham and UCL, usually concerning the auto-icon, that his head was used as a football, that his head was stolen by students from King's College, and that a ransom was demanded for its return, that a tree which grew outside the provost office was where Bentham used to sit, and that it was therefore never to be pruned. Sadly, it no longer exists. The role of Bentham as the founder of UCL, despite what may have been claimed or implied in both informed and uninformed sources, has never been seriously accepted by even the most zealous enthusiast for Bentham. The more pertinent question is the extent to which Bentham can be regarded as its intellectual inspiration. I'll try to take a more sober look now at Bentham's relationship with UCL. And the most important aspect of that relationship, in my opinion, is not the fact that the auto-icon has taken up residence in the student centre, but the fact that UCL Library holds about 85,000 pages of Bentham's manuscripts, donated to college by John Bowring, Bentham's literary executor, after the publication in 1843 of an 11-volume edition of Bentham's works that we refer to as the Bowring edition. And there are around another 15,000 pages in the British Library, so 100,000 in total. By the 1930s, the Bowring edition had been recognised as unfit for purpose, and after a delay caused by the Second World War, UCL was eventually persuaded to establish a Bentham committee to oversee the production of a new Bentham edition, which it did in 1959. The Bentham project has now produced 38 volumes, with a 39th at the press, UCL Press, I'm pleased to say, in an edition that is expected to run to a total of at least 85 volumes. So here we have one of the world's great philosophers whose writings have never been properly edited. As each volume in the edition is produced, more and more attention is being paid to Bentham and his achievements being increasingly recognised. But getting the proper resources to carry on this unique programme is very difficult indeed. But one of our initiatives, if anyone out there would like to help, is Transcribe Bentham, where volunteers are asked to transcribe Bentham manuscripts. It's not easy, but since its establishment in 2010, volunteers have transcribed over 45,000 pages of Bentham's manuscripts. Incredible. The Bentham Project, we ourselves have transcribed about 35,000 pages, so there are still about 20,000 pages left to do. Our aspiration is to get the job done by the time of the bicentenary of Bentham's death in 2032. Here you see the welcome page to Transcribe Bentham, which gives you instructions on how to transcribe Bentham manuscripts. This is a manuscript on one side with a transcript already produced on the left-hand side. And here's our appeal to you to see whether you can become one of our transcribers and indeed one of our super transcribers. Moving on. The limit of Bentham's practical influence in the foundation of UCL is soon demonstrated. Writing on 13th of September 1827, Bentham attempted to persuade Henry Broome to support the appointment of John Bowring as Professor of English Literature here. He supported the application by pointing out that Bowring was a noted linguist, that he had studied universal grammar, and that Bentham would give him access to his own manuscripts on the subject. Had an extensive acquaintance with books and authors, was a talented poet, and had translated poetry from several languages into English. Bowring could also function as a secretary for foreign correspondence and would be an excellent recruiter of foreign students. There's nothing new under the sun. Bentham hoped that Bowring's sectarianism, he was a Unitarian, would not be an obstacle to his appointment. And Bentham went on, "I do not find in the constitution of the university any such thing as an obligation to subscribe to the 39 articles, that is, of the Church of England. The London University is not designed for an anti-heretical university, surely. For the exclusionary system, Oxford, Cambridge and Dublin may be deemed sufficient." Bentham also hoped that Bowring's political radicalism would not be an objection. Broome admitted Bowring's talents, but the problem was his financial reputation. He was held responsible for the Greek loan scandal, which had ruined his reputation in the eyes of foreigners, and made an appointment as Secretary to Foreign Correspondence impossible, says Broome, till he is cleared. Now, on the 1st of January 1828, Bentham took up the matter again. He'd heard that Bowring's election to the professorship would depend upon Broome and James Mill supporting it, but both of them were decidedly against him and instead were in favour of a Mr. Dale, whom Bentham had never heard of. Bentham went on to complain of the aristocratically close conduct pursued by you in conjunction with Mr. Mill in the management of the London University, which had all along appeared to me to be in the teeth of those democratical principles of mine which are in print. However, Bentham admitted that, having the success of the university project at heart, there was no one so apt for the management of it as Broome and Mill. In the professorship of literature, Bowring, Bentham opined, would be at full liberty to embrace every occasion for preaching the gospel of utilitarianism. In the event, Mr. Dale, Rector the Reverend Thomas Dale, was officially appointed to the Chair of English Literature, the Chair of English Language and Literature, by the Council of the University on the 21st of January 1828. The evangelical Dale, in his introductory lecture, stated that it was his intention to omit no opportunity of impressing on the minds of students the necessity of religious belief and holding up to their reprobation all writers, the tendency of whose works was to bring religion into contempt. On his appointment as incumbent at St Matthew's, Denmark Hill in 1830, Dale resigned his professorship. But in 1836, he was appointed to what was presumably a more congenial chair, that of English Literature and History at King's College. Now, one notable Benthamite who was appointed, however, was John Hostin, who became the first professor of jurisprudence under the law of nations. But it's time to say something about King's College. The establishment of King's College was a direct response to the founding of the University of London. George Doyley, rector of Lambeth and chaplain to the Archbishop of Canterbury, wrote to Home Secretary Robert Peel in February 1828, proposing the foundation of a Church of England University in London under the patronage of George IV, where Christianity would be an essential part of the curriculum. An inaugural meeting attended by the Duke of Wellington took place on the 29th of June 1828, and King's College opened in 1831. Here we see a plate from 1828, King's College versus London University, or which is the weightiest? Obviously King's College, weighted down as it is by fat bishops with their money and interest, against which sense and science counts for very little. The figures representing King's College are the Archbishop of Canterbury, Doyley, the Bishop of London, and the Bishop of Chester. Not all the figures representing the university have been identified, though the first one is Henry Broome, holding a broom, of course, while the figure in the dressing gown holding his books is Bentham. It may seem odd to identify Bentham with a man in a dressing gown, given the rather sober image we have of him thanks to the auto-icon. But here is Bentham's actual dressing gown, which appears to match that in the cartoon. The dressing gown is made from cotton with a floral pattern in a Japanese style on a pale yellow background. The authenticity of the item, which was probably repurposed from a woman's dress, has been confirmed by the Textile Conservation Centre at the University of Southampton. It was donated along with the mourning ring to Bentham's servant boy and is privately owned, and so there's no question, I think, over the provenance. Anyway, setting aside the practicalities of founding a university, there are two areas in which Bentham has a plausible claim to be regarded as the intellectual inspiration for the University of London. The first relates to religious tests, and the second to the structure of the curriculum. In other words, who should be taught and what should be taught. Bentham had matriculated at Queen's College, Oxford in 1760 when aged 12. One of Bentham's most distressing experiences was being forced in 1764, at the age of 16, to subscribe to the 39 Articles of the Church of England in order to take his degree at Oxford. He very reluctantly did so. This was the most notable occasion, perhaps the only occasion, on which he was forced to compromise, as he saw it, his intellectual integrity. The problem was the involvement of the Church of England in education. The Church of England was not interested in truth, thought Bentham, but in maintaining its wealth, power and influence. Bentham's riposte did not appear for over 50 years. It was entitled Church of Englandism and its Catechism Examined, published in 1818, and he referred to it as an expiation. It constituted a wide-ranging critique of the Church in the guise of condemning its policy of forcing children in its schools, more precisely the schools of the National Society, to learn the Catechism and thereby to declare their belief in the nonsense it contained. While corrupting the minds of the children of Church of Englandists, the system excluded the children of non-Church of Englandists from a primary education, just as the two Church of England universities excluded non-Church of Englandists. Bentham called for the euthanasia of the Church of England. As clerical vacancies occurred, their offices should be abolished. He advocated the same happy death for the universities. As posts became vacant, they should simply not be filled. Rooms in colleges might be offered to more worthy incumbents, such as veterans from the Army or Navy. For Bentham, the point was to divorce religion from education, just as it was to divorce religion from legislation. As he said, theology was about as much relevance to a book of legislation as it was to a book of cookery. This radical but tolerant secularism was a fundamental ingredient of Bentham's thought and was the basis on which UCL was founded. Bentham, in fact, went much further in his opposition to religion, stating that religion should have no influence in morals and politics. All politics and decisions should be justified by reference to the principle of utility. Bentham's basic point was that education should not depend upon submitting to a religious test. That principle was enshrined in the Constitution of the University of London. Now I'm going to move on to Bentham's religious ideas. Bentham invented the term chrestomathea, taken from the Greek to mean conducive to useful learning. He didn't consider that the main subjects he had studied at Oxford, namely theology and dead languages, fell into that category. The work Chrestomathea, which Bentham wrote, printed and published in the mid-1810s, 1815 to 1817, contains his template for the curriculum and teaching methods which he proposed for adoption in the Chrestomathic school that he agreed should be built in his enormous garden in Westminster, now ironically the site of the Ministry of Justice. The school was never built, but many of the promoters of the Chrestomathic school went on to be promoters of the London University. Now, in my opinion, Bentham's Chrestomathea is one of the greatest books of philosophy ever written, though I doubt that you will find it mentioned in any of the standard textbooks on the history of philosophy. I can only touch on certain aspects of Bentham's discussion. What immediately stands out, though, is his encyclopedical table or art and science table. Prior to writing Chrestomathea, and with a view to writing it, Bentham had written a substantial essay on logic, recently just published in the Collected Works, which reacted against the Aristotelian logic that he had been taught at Queen's College, Oxford. One of the points that he emphasised in his writings on logic was the importance of classification, providing it was done systematically by means of what he called the exhaustively bifurcate method. We can see Bentham applying this method to the arts and sciences, or disciplines, in order to bring out the connections between them, giving them new names in the process. The terms, for instance, natural philosophy and natural history, which were the standard names for what we now call the physical and biological sciences respectively, were two examples of names that were, in Bentham's words, misexpressive, in that they failed to give correct conceptions of their subject matters. As an aside, it's worth noting that Bentham's views on language were extraordinarily original and arguably have still not yet been properly appreciated by those philosophers who, Bentham might have thought, have had the misfortune to fall into the pits prepared for them by such misguided thinkers as Plato, Aristotle, and Immanuel Kant, not to mention the whole host of what Bentham called the Scotch metaphysicians. While language was the instrument of thought and communication, Bentham pointed to its deceptive properties, as well as names for the things that we perceived, the names of real entities. Language inevitably included names for things that were incapable of perception, the names of fictitious entities, for instance, rights, powers, obligations, not to mention motion, time, and qualities such as sweetness, hardness, redness. It was often assumed that because there existed a name, some really existing thing corresponded to that name. But this assumption was false. Bentham invented techniques for translation propositions in which the names of fictitious entities occurred into propositions that contained only real entities or entities closer to real entities. Only when such a translation could be undertaken did the proposition in question have any meaning. But to return to the encyclopedical table, we can see that Bentham devised a wholly new nomenclature, reflecting the new classification. It all begins with eudaimonics, or well-being, or happiness, ultimately understood in terms of pleasure, with ill-being, suffering being understood in terms of pain. The first great division is between disciplines that concern body as opposed to mind. In relation to the latter, the next division is between those that concern the intellectual as opposed to those that concern the sensitive faculty. In the bottom right-hand corner, we eventually get to ethics. Even though the names of the disciplines appear unwieldy, Bentham argued that they gave a proper indication of the subject matter and of how each discipline was related to every other. The common end of each discipline was to increase well-being. Moreover, because a discipline had what was known as a hard name did not mean that it should not be studied by the Chrestomathic scholars. Even at the introductory phase, the scholars would be taught mineralogy, botany, zoology, astronomy, and geography. Botany, says Bentham, for example, what is it? An acquaintance more or less correct and extensive with the external appearances of different sets of plants. Not only a working gardener, but every common labourer in husbandry, every greengrocer, every herb woman is, to a certain degree, and in the same way, a botanist. There are two elements at play here. One is a democratization of knowledge. The other is an undermining of word magic. In other words, the stripping away of misleading associations in the language that we use. This had a special resonance for Bentham in the sphere of democratic politics. For instance, in order to delude the people, the name crown was given to a sort of hat and throne to a sort of chair. But I'll leave Bentham's thoughts on politics and monarchy for another occasion. So back to the Chrestomathic scholars and their education. The school was intended for scholars from the age of 6 or 7 up to 14, boys as well as girls, though they would be taught separately. They would be taught by the Lancasterian or monitorial system, which had been devised for the teaching of the children of the poor, but which in the Chrestomathic school would be extended for the use of the middling and higher ranks in life. The first point to be answered was, what was the purpose of education? For Bentham, education was both vocational, in that it formed the basis for acquiring a livelihood, and recreational, in that it avoided the danger of ennui in our moments of repose. Bentham also pointed out that the intellectual pleasures were more valuable than the sensual, though it should be emphasised that he by no means disdained the sensual pleasures, unlike his successor in the utilitarian tradition, John Stuart Mill. That being educated meant that a person was less likely to get up to mischief, and that an education gave a person admission into good company. Hence, we can see that when Bentham referred to useful learning, he did not mean useful in a narrow sense as fitting a person for work, and hence useful to the community as a whole, but in the most extended sense as fitting a person for a happy life. The point about ennui is where we must consider the case of Mr. Beardmore. His obituary appeared in the monthly magazine, 1st of April 1814, and was reproduced by Bentham in Chrestomathea. John Beardmore worked for a porter brewing firm, of which he became a partner. Eventually, he, according to the report, he withdrew himself from business and retired to Islington. But from the hour in which he quitted business, he grew insensibly more and more the victim of listlessness and ennui. Despite confirmed health, independent property, an amiable wife, numerous friends, a plentiful table, and a social neighbourhood, Mr. Beardmore was conscious of a vacuum. This produced the sad denouement. Want of customary application brought on relaxation of activity, want of exercise, languor of body, and depression of spirits. A train of evils ensued, comprising loss of appetite, nervous affections, debility, mental and corporeal, decay, pain, and death. The account of poor Mr. Beardmore was headed Fatal Effects of Ennui, the Disease of an Unfurnished Mind, illustrated by an example. Bentham discussed the choice of subjects and the order in which they were to be studied. By presenting scholars with a wide range of subjects, each individual had a greater chance of finding pursuits that were suitable to their talents and inclinations. Moreover, thanks to the encyclopedical table, or the tree of knowledge, it was possible to show scholars how different subjects were connected to each other. Learning was to be fun, as Bentham noted, every task may be converted into play. There would be no corporal punishment. Bentham, moreover, pointed the pleasure that a student received from getting his or her lesson. Now, isn't this a very good reason to be cautious about the use of AI in arts and humanities education? Where is the pleasure in copying the bland, copyright infringing babble of a logarithm? We don't want to be producing Mr. Beardmores. Anyway, the Chrestomathic school would be managed in such a way as to produce good order, the great source of internal tranquility and instrument of good management, says Bentham. The school, as noted above, would be run on the monitorial system, whereby the master taught the senior scholars and they in turn taught the junior. Bentham pointed out that one learned more about a subject when one was the instructor than when one was being instructed. As well as scholar teachers, there would be scholar tutors who would each have responsibility for helping one more junior scholar. The school would incorporate the punishment minimising and reward economising principles. Punishment would be minimised because transgressions would be minimised by the fact that the scholars were under constant inspection, as well as the tutelary, thanks both to the panoptic design and the tutelary influence of the scholar tutor. The possibility of idleness would be reduced by the short lesson principle, whereby each lesson would last for 10 minutes. And under the place capturing principle, the highest placed scholars would start to say his lesson, but if he made a mistake, and this was pointed out by the second rank scholar, they would then exchange places, thereby converting the intellectual exercise into a game. The scholar jury principle would see any punishment for misbehaviour decided by the scholars themselves. Under the comparative proficiency principle, the place of the scholar in relation to a number of exercises would be recorded, and thereby the scholar's capacity for promotion to a higher class or to the role of scholar tutor indicated, and so on to the number of over 40 interlinked principles. The overall idea was that each scholar would be able to progress at a rate that was consonant to their abilities. He or she would not move on until they had got the relevant lessons, but no one would be considered incapable of getting the instruction. So here's Bentham's summary of the Chrestomathic School project. He writes, whatsoever practical and familiar utility is seen to belong to these several branches of scientific instruction will be carefully looked out for and completely and diligently held up to view and placed in the most amusing as well as clear and instructive light. The design of this institution being not to raise up a few scholastic pedants, but to breed up in every walk of life a numerous and continually increasing succession of intelligent and useful, and as far as the condition of human beings in this life admits, contented and happy men, not to pamper pride, but to assist and cherish personal freedom and general benevolence. The Chrestomathic School was never built. Bentham instead recommended Hazelwood School near Birmingham, run by Thomas Wright Hill and his sons, including Rowland Hill of postal fame. At Bentham's suggestion, the Hills opened an offshoot at Bruce Castle, Tottenham, which is today a museum and archive centre for the London Borough of Haringey. Anyway, to conclude, here's an image of Bentham in 1823. What's important is not that Bentham did not take it upon himself to become involved in the practical arrangements for the foundation of the university, and it shouldn't be forgotten, he was nearly 80 years old at the time, but that his ideas provided the inspiration for those who were involved. Bentham was very much reacting against his own experience of education as a boarder at Westminster School and then as a 12 to 16-year-old at Queen's College, Oxford. Much of the formal education he received was theology and dead languages. He himself was keenly interested in chemistry and botany. Those were the sorts of subjects he thought should be taught in his Chrestomathic school. As for the universities of Oxford and Cambridge, they were, I quote, great public nuisances. Bentham's significance for UCL doesn't lie in the fact that we have his corpse, but in the fact that we have his corpus. and that the corpus represents one of the most important unedited collections of manuscripts existent in the world today. Both from the point of view of historical importance and contemporary significance, Bentham is an immense figure, and the new scholarly edition of his work is deepening our understanding and our appreciation of the sheer power, subtlety, and value of his thought. In the end, perhaps just as appropriate as the question, what has Bentham done for UCL, is the question, what has UCL done for Bentham? And the reason that UCL has done and is doing this, that is supporting the new edition of Bentham's works, is not because of some bizarre attachment to a foundation myth, but because of a recognition of the sheer importance of the ideas of perhaps one of the greatest philosophers and reformers of modern times. If UCL wishes to define its mission for the future, it could do much worse than look to the Benthamic vision which has inspired its past. And I would summarise that vision as take nothing for granted, experiment, get the evidence, apply your knowledge, promote the well-being of all, or if that is not possible, promote the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Thank you so much for your attention. I will finish there.
Thank you, Professor Schofield, for a great lecture, both a crestomathic lecture full of useful knowledge and philosophy, and also the history of the institution and the ideas behind the institution. We have now, and you can see it on the screen, this Q&A. We have a QR code. You can submit questions to Slido, which is sli.do. And we actually have a few questions already in the Slido. The first question is, does UCL fund the work of the Bentham Project?
Yes, it does, and not UCL as such, but the Faculty of Laws in UCL. So yeah, I don't want to be too pedantic, but the Bentham Project is an academic unit within the Faculty of Laws, and the Faculty of Laws supports two posts, mine and a principal researcher, Dr. Tim Causer. But UCL generally, through an interdisciplinary fund, has just given us some funding for two research posts for the next year or so. We do have to apply externally for grants, and I've had grants from the Leavium Trust, from the Arts and Humanities Research Council, the Economic and Social Research Council, the Wellcome Trust, and so on and so forth over the years. But it's a constant struggle to find funds. But we are now we now have a strategy in place, which I hope, if it's successful, will lead to more permanent funding for the Bentham Project, so we can actually get on and spend our time on the job of editing Bentham rather than trying to find money in order to fund posts so that we can get on with the job of editing Bentham. So the institution is now giving us some wonderful support, and I hope that the outlook for the future will be is bright. But thank you for that question. I mean, there's a lot more I could say about funding, and we've just we are about. I mean, this may be anticipated things, but we have a conference of an organisation called the International Society for Utilitarian Studies, which meets every 2 years. Our last conference was here at UCL. We'll have another one here in 2032 to celebrate the 200th anniversary of Bentham's death. But we have a conference in Macau in China next week, at which we will be launching a Bentham Appeal Fund, and so that's an important new development. But thank you for that question.
And historically, the project had been in the history department.
Yes, the first general editor appointed in 1961 was J.H. Burns, who was then reader in the history of political thought and became professor of the history of political thought, and he was the first general editor. And as Professor Burns was in the history department, I suppose it made sense to the college authorities that the Bentham project should be located in the history department. It's a long story, but we eventually came into the law faculties when I became sole general editor in about 2002, I think it was. And it makes sense in that Bentham saw himself first and foremost as a legal philosopher. And so that we have masses of writings on law, which we have yet to, yet to produce. And it was probably the lawyers through the 19th into 20th century who were more interested in Bentham than any other discipline. But that's changed over in recent years. In that interest in Bentham comes from many disciplines now. But I think being in the Faculty of Laws does make a lot of sense. And for many years, the chair of the Bentham Committee, which, excuse me, oversees the Bentham project, was Herbert Hart, HLA Hart, who was arguably the foremost legal philosopher of the 20th century. And he was followed by William Twining, who, again, very important and influential legal philosopher. So there are very close connections with the law faculty.
And how would you connect the legal philosophic project of Bentham with the educational philosophic project? So whether it's the project parts of the interest in codification, to what extent do those things show up or have linkages or lineages with the educational philosophy of Bentham?
Yeah, I mean that's really interesting because Bentham wanted legal education not to teach the law as it is, so that people can go and practice law, but rather law as it ought to be. And he distinguished between a school of law and a school of legislation. And he advocated a school of legislation. So you thought about how the law should be reformed, what was the best form in which we can, practically put the law. And that, in his view, was codification, and obviously there was much more to Bentham's legal thinking than is captured in the word codification. But that was the umbrella in which you can understand it. And he was a very severe critique of the common law. Another part of Bentham's education was in the law courts. His father, who was a lawyer, wanted Bentham to follow him in the career of the law. And so once he left Oxford University, he went to the Inns of Court, attended the common law courts, the great common law courts in Westminster Hall. And on his 21st birthday, the earliest date you could, he was admitted to the bar at Lincoln's Inn. But that very same year, 1769, he decided practicing the law was not his vocation. That was not what he wanted to do. And he sort of said, tremblingly, he came to the answer that his vocation was to reform the law. It was a science of legislation that he was going to devote his career to. This greatly disappointed his father, but Bentham stuck to it, and he embarked on his career of law reform. But that led into all sorts of other areas, because law for Bentham was the key to a civilized life, and it thought it was important to get the law right. And he was began by criticizing Bentham and the whole common law system for its fictions, its irrationalities, its fact that it favored the rich over the poor, and when it came to the education of lawyers, as I say, what he wanted them to do was not to learn how to work with the law as it was, but to think about how it should be reformed.
Great. And we have a question coming out both out of your thoughts on AI, but also on the philosophy of education. There's a question in the Slido from Ed, EDD. Have you considered AI capabilities? This is, I guess, directed to Professor Schofield. Have you considered AI capabilities to assist with the transcription process, presumably the transcription of Bentham, or prior to this, engaged any form of optical character recognition scanning slash software processes, other libraries, university archives, perhaps an approach via JISC may have some relevant experience to share, question mark. So I guess the question is, would the Bentham project use AI to transcribe Bentham, or is the human, the trained human eye to be better than the AI?
No, that's a great question actually, because for 7 or 8 years we were involved with the research group funded by the European Research Council. That's a funder I forgot to mention. Developing the Transcribers project, which now has 500,000 users and is using a form of AI to transcribe historical manuscripts. As I said, we were closely involved in the development of that program, and the developers, the computer scientists, brought us in because of our crowdsourcing experience, but also because of our expertise with the Bentham manuscripts. The Bentham manuscripts, in their view, presented all the sorts of problems that needed to be solved in order to read complex handwritten documents. And in terms of Bentham, it's failed. With some of Bentham manuscripts are in the hand of his copyists, so it's a nice copperplate set out in standard lines, and it manages very well with that. And we've also been involved with colleagues from University of Toronto, a joint enterprise which UCL helped funded to help them read medieval Latin, and again, amazingly successful. My colleague Chris Riley was involved in that and was getting nearly 100% accuracy. But with Bentham's manuscripts, it's hopeless. The layout is complex because I don't even remember the sheet I briefly showed, but he would write a date and a heading at the top, a marginal, and then a marginal subheading, would write his text, would go over it, correct it. So there's all sorts of interlineations, then write summaries in the margin, and it just can't cope. So we need human beings to transcribe Bentham. So no, thank you for that question, and I'm very pleased to highlight our role in the wonderfully successful transcribers program.
So in a way, the AI, to the extent that it has learned more from the Bentham project than the Bentham project has learned from AI in some.
I think that's a very fair way of putting it. I mean, there were many other groups involved, including major libraries and other people who held archives. The Diocese of Passau and its parish registers, for instance, were that was one of the layout problems which had to be solved. But there you had a standard form, whereas with Bentham's manuscripts, there's no such thing as a standard form. Also, his handwriting as he gets older is extremely difficult to read. Takes months and months of practice before you're anywhere near competent. So we they spent a lot of time using Bentham manuscripts in order to try and and solve the problems, and it helped them. Um, and there were one particularly notable success from the Polytechnic University of Valencia is a word spotting program, which is on our Bentham Project website, where we can search the Bentham manuscripts for individual phrases or words, and that is pretty amazing. So we're not against the use of AI where it can be helpful. My particular point was when it comes to educating students in arts and humanities, they need to be developing their own intellectual capacities, not copying something that has been generated by a machine. They need to be reading what real people have written, thinking about it, not, I say, merely copying. They need to be getting their lessons. So that's the issue I have with AI in arts and humanities education.
Yeah, great. And would you situate, I mean, would you situate Bentham within a kind of larger tradition, either going forward, you could say utilitarianism, or also going backward in some sense, projects of say philosophic reform, whether going, dating back to say Thomas
Yeah,
More or
yeah,
Francis
yeah,
Bacon or
yeah.
Thomas Hobbes, where you have also systems of classification, critiques of the common law, but also projects for the advancement of learning, one might say.
I know that's a really interesting point because it's quite difficult to just pinpoint where Bentham comes from. Um, we're making progress, but I remember in a bit of an obscure article that the famous intellectual historian J.G.A. Pocock says he in a sort of a survey of 18th century thinkers says he just does not know what planet Bentham comes from. Um, it's quite extraordinary given that his father was a very devout Church of Englandist. In fact, his two grandfathers were ministers in the Church of England. Um, there was even a bishop in his ancestry. He was sent to Westminster School, where the headmaster was a future Archbishop of Canterbury. He went to the Tory University of Oxford. Cambridge was much more open to utilitarian ideas than Oxford. He was trained in the law, and yet probably in his teens he was questioning it all. So there's got to be links to the French Enlightenment and the skeptical thinkers like Helvetius and Voltaire, the people he mentions. There are links to the British empirical tradition. Locke and Hume and Hartley are important. But I think there's still a great deal of work to do, particularly now we've got his just recently published his writings on logic, in terms of understanding how his thought fits into or reacts to the logic and the ethics he was taught at Oxford, and also to the general background of the understanding of the philosophy of language. In terms of going forward, it's the standard account is that the 19th century produced three great utilitarians. One was Jeremy Bentham, followed by John Stuart Mill, followed by Henry Sidgwick. And John Stuart Mill is obviously the most famous. And if you study utilitarianism in a history of political thought course, well, you'll take John Stuart Mill's On Liberty or his essay on utilitarianism, nice short text you can do in a week. There's no similar easily approachable work for Bentham. And Sidgwick, you've got his massive methods of ethics. So utilitarianism, at least at undergraduate level, master's level, tends to be dominated by John Stuart Mill. But there is so much more in that tradition, and particularly in Bentham, and we're only just becoming aware of that. And I think we need to also think about where does the radical subversive Bentham go? Who picks up that tradition in the 19th century? There is a liberal democratic tradition which comes from Bentham, but there's also a more subversive one. So I think there are still we're just generating more and more questions about Bentham every time we produce a volume in the collected works.
So yeah, we have to thank Professor Schofield for the privilege of learning about Bentham from the world expert on Bentham via the UCL lunch lectures today. Before we close, if you'd like to explore more of what's happening during UCL's bicentenary year, there are several ways to get involved. You can book a place on the UCL 200 walking tour to discover our full program through the UCL 200 events calendar and visit the UCL 200 exhibition, which is running throughout the year 2026. We also have 3 new UCL 200 publications. All of these are linked on the UCL 200 web pages, so simply scan the QR code on the screen to find out more. Thank you. And we have that up, and that's the QR code on this most recent slide. So thank you above all to Professor Schofield and to all of you for listening, and no less to the organizers of the lunch lecture hour for the privilege of learning from Professor Schofield this afternoon. So thank you.